Welcome, everyone. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. And this is a very, very special occasion today. Today we mark the Class of 1950 Fellows program and the public presentation during that program. Let me just say a word about the Class of 1950 Fellows program. It was inaugurated in the spring of the year 2001. Members of that class, the class of 1950, were actually the first to benefit from 4 full years of President John Sloan Dickey's strong efforts to better prepare future generations of Dartmouth students for global leadership. And at their 50th reunion in the spring of the year 2000, the class presented a generous gift to the Dickey Center with the purpose, and I quote, to bring distinguished foreign leaders, scholars, and specialists to the Dartmouth campus for short periods to interface with the students on the important issues of the day. The class of 1950 Senior Foreign Affairs Fellow typically when he or she is on campus, meets with student groups, teaches classes, delivers a public address, and does a variety of other things. And it's really been a wonderful, wonderful event, for both students and faculty. And I would like today to pay special tribute to the class of 1950. There are 4 officers of the class of 1950 who are here. And I'd like to call their names, and please greet them very, very warmly. And if there are other members of the class of 1950 and I don't have your names, please also rise. But please let me recognize Joe Medlicott. Jack Harned. David Taylor. And Jacques Harlow. And are there any other members of the class of 1950 here? Then let's just give a round of applause for the class of 1950. Today's subject is a fascinating and a very important one. I did some calculations over the last couple of days about the number of public events that the Dickey Center has sponsored this academic year, and the number of those that in one way or another touched on the Middle East and associated issues. And I found that more than half touched on the Middle East and associated issues, which I think tells you that no matter what you try to do in today's world, we keep coming back to that region of the world. It is absolutely vital today. And just some of the issues that we're looking at on a day-to-day basis. Iran, the question of nuclear weapons and what are we going to do about it. The war in Iraq, which I need not say more about. Arab-Israeli issues. The new Hamas-led government in Palestine. The new government, the new Prime Minister Olmert in Israel, questions about Egypt and the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in Egypt, a pivotal country in the Middle East, questions of oil, our dependency, and gasoline going above $3 a gallon now, democracy building, we've read and heard a lot about it. And when you get down to it at the base, what we're really talking about now in terms of this country is a president's legacy, because these issues very, very clearly are going to determine how President Bush is going to be looked at by the historians, in the future. So these are really important issues that are consuming all of us. And we are extremely fortunate, and I underline extremely, to have a truly outstanding expert in Middle Eastern affairs, one of the State Department's leading experts in Middle Eastern affairs, a very distinguished diplomat, a very distinguished scholar with us today. Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer is a colleague, a friend, and someone that I didn't serve in the Middle East, but I certainly knew of him and admired him greatly. And I can tell you, anyone in the Foreign Service who serves both as the U.S. Ambassador to Israel and the U.S. Ambassador to Egypt has had a very, very successful career. But he's not only been a successful diplomat, he's also a very outstanding scholar. He holds a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from Columbia University. And now, like me, he's had the good fortune to come to a wonderful academic institution. He is now the S. Daniel Abraham Visiting Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. But let me just say a few words in a little bit more detail about Dan's career. He joined the faculty of the Woodrow Wilson School in 2006 after retiring from the Foreign Service and the State Department with the rank of career minister, a very, very distinguished achievement, I can tell you. Between 2001 and 2005, he served as the United States Ambassador to Israel, and immediately prior to that, from 1997 to 2001, he was the U.S. Ambassador in Egypt. He was a member of the American delegation to the Israel-Palestinian autonomy negotiations from 1979 through 82, and helped negotiate the creation of the multinational force and observers in the Sinai 1981-82. Dan crafted the 1988 Peace Initiative of Secretary of State George Shultz, and in 1991 served as a member of the United States peace team that brought about the Madrid Peace Conference. And just so you know that I'm not the only one who thinks so highly of him, he has received several of the U.S. government's most prestigious awards, including the President's Distinguished Service Award, the Department of State Distinguished Service Award, the National Intelligence Community's Award for Achievement, and the Director General of the Foreign Service Award for Political Reporting. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Dan Kurtzer.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Ken Yalowitz for that overly warm introduction, and to thank him and the Dickey Center for the invitation to join you. I also want to echo Ken's words of praise for the class of 1950 and actually suggest that they come up here and tell us how they look so good on their 56th reunion. So keep going. This really is an inspiration to all of us. It's been a pleasure to be here in Hanover at Dartmouth College, and as I've been telling people the last 2 days, there are a number of similarities both in the experience that Ken and I have had in our foreign service careers and then coming to first-rate academic institutions, and Princeton and Dartmouth have many similarities as well in a relatively small college environment in which the undergraduate education is the real focus of what the university is all about. And so I want to express admiration to all of you, both from the community and from the college, for having created what is now one of the premier universities, colleges in the United States, and to tell you that it's been a real pleasure to be here for the last couple of days and hope that I can come back and visit you often. Having said all that, you would therefore expect me to give you an upbeat presentation about the Middle East, and I have to tell you that I've worked hard over these past days to try to find something positive to say. But I'm going to disappoint you if that's your expectation, because what I really want to do today is talk about the challenges that the United States has faced and continues to face in this very challenging region, and to offer not only a description of the problem, but also perhaps at the end share a prescription of what we might do to change what seems to be a region that is impervious to change and with problems that seem so endemically rooted that one finds it hard to imagine that they will change. So let me kind of give you an overview of what I see as the 5 or 6 major problems in the Middle East that seem to have defied all efforts, both within the region from the outside, to change them. To talk a little bit then about what the United States has tried to do in terms of the pursuit of our national interests. What policy have we pursued and what successes have we enjoyed or not enjoyed? And then to leave you with some thoughts about what we might do differently. Last night I had the opportunity to address some particular issues in the Arab-Israeli dimension, and I'd be happy to come back to that in the question and answer period. But the formal presentation will take a somewhat broader look. We'll widen the aperture of the camera, take a broader look at the region and some of the particular issues that U.S. Policymakers have faced as they have approached these problems. The first that I would point to is in the area of globalization. We've seen in the last particularly 15 years, 10 years, the way in which many societies around the world have come to understand the changes in the global economy and the degree to which they needed to find a niche in which to operate effectively and to produce something that the global economy would require. It's been hard around the world for economies to make that transition. We saw how hard it was even in our advanced economy as we readjusted to the challenges of NAFTA. And it was even harder for Mexico. But those societies that have adapted to the particular requirements and the expected benefits of globalization have found that niche for themselves and have been able to contribute to global economic progress. You look at the Middle East and it seems to be oblivious of globalization. The Middle East produces something that the world needs, and that's energy, oil and gas. But there is almost nothing that this region produces that has human added value that is required by other countries in order to fuel their economies or to continue international trade. Not only is this the case, but the Middle East doesn't really trade in a manner that makes sense. A couple of years ago, one of our undersecretaries visited the region and had done a study of trading patterns in the Middle East and found that Middle Eastern countries, apart from Israel, have 93% of their trade with countries outside the Middle East and only 7% of their trade with their more immediate neighbors. Now, it doesn't take an economist or a trade specialist to know that if you're not trading with your neighbor, with whom it will be cheaper and more efficient and more effective, there's something wrong with either what you're doing or what your neighbor is doing. And when both you and your neighbor are finding it necessary to skip over each other and trade outside a region, it tells you that there's a major dysfunction in the trading relationship. Now, the Middle East is not unaware of globalization. When I was ambassador in Cairo, we obtained permission to translate Tom Friedman's book, The Alexis and the Olive Tree. And we translated it into Arabic and then distributed thousands of copies throughout society to academics, business leaders, public policy people. And then I invited Friedman to Cairo to meet with a selected audience. He had about a week in which he gave lectures and met with small groups. And had you been a fly on the wall of our residence in the discussion with 80 of Egypt's major leaders, these were business leaders, some ministers in the cabinet, you would have been amazed because the discussion was not how to make Egypt a part of the world economy. The discussion ended up into an argument. Why are you telling us that we have to be part of the world economy? We don't want to be part of the world economy. And in fact, if we become part of the world economy, the Egyptian intellectuals told Mr. Friedman, we will somehow lose our cultural norms and it will impact on our self-worth as Egyptians. And so there was real resistance to the idea that Friedman had brought. Now, no one expected Friedman's ideas to be accepted lock, stock, and barrel. They're quite controversial not only elsewhere in the world, but also in this country. But I frankly was surprised because I had expected at least a dialogue to take place, to pick and choose what Friedman might have been suggesting that could have been useful to Egypt and to reject those issues that were not. And apparently the Egyptians found nothing in that book are nothing of Friedman's ideas that were of use. So the first issue I would point to is this resistance to not just the idea of globalization, but to even those elements of involvement in the global economy which would be beneficial to Middle Eastern states. Second issue, question of energy. Now, as I mentioned, the Middle East is known as one of the great reservoirs of gas and oil production in the world, and much of the Middle East's wealth derives from its ability to manage those resources and reserves. In fact, we know that today, paying a premium at the pump, we still pay a lot less than many people around the world, but we're feeling the crunch of the price that's being established by oil and gas producers around the world, including in the Middle East. The question is, what has the Middle East done with the resources that they've earned from the oil and gas revenues? About 2 months ago, I was invited to a conference in Doha, Qatar, and it was a conference devoted to this idea of what should the Middle East do with the windfall energy profits. And there were a number of people from Europe, from Russia, China, Japan, and the United States, and we had a very good set of discussions over a course of 3 days, in which one of the interesting conclusions that the Westerners brought to the dialogue was to suggest to the Middle Easterners that since energy has been your thing for the last 50, 75 years, why don't you become the masters of alternative energy? In other words, why don't you become the funders of the R&D that's required to produce alternative energy so that in effect you'll end up controlling not only natural energy resources, but also synthetic and other kinds of energy resources into the future. So we had a very good discussion. The next day after this conference, I traveled to Dubai en route to Yemen. And I told some people today, what I found in Dubai was a total focus on Tiger Woods. Tiger Woods was invited to the United Arab Emirates, to Dubai, for a golf tournament with millions of dollars in a pot for golfers around the world. Now, I don't want to get carried away, and I'm being a little bit facetious because obviously Dubai has created for itself something of a commercial and information technology center. But the juxtaposition of these two events, how you spend your oil and gas resources, and a golf tournament the next day, seemed to me to be emblematic of the problem that's faced in the Middle East. There hasn't been enough investment of the energy profits in the Middle East in activities that will be sustainable beyond the end of oil and gas reserves. There's a lot of investment by Middle Eastern countries in the United States and in Europe. There's a lot of purchasing of our bonds, our treasury bonds. Much of it is fueling our own consumption patterns, in fact. But the question that has to be asked by Middle Easterners and by those of us who have studied in and worked on the Middle East for many years is why haven't they translated some of their oil and gas wealth into a productive enterprise in their region, which also produces jobs for their region. Third issue, which I think was covered by some speakers earlier this year, was the question of democratization. Now, we tend to think of that today as a problem that the United States has created for the region. And in fact, there is reason to be critical of ourselves in trying to export not only the idea of democracy, which has a long history in our country. We have, for many, many decades, had this idea that we have something to share with the world called democracy, and we're happy to tell the world about it. But we now have an administration that wants to actually share the practice of democracy and import it through an invasion of a country. But the problem I want to deal with is not so much what we have done, but to ask the question, why have the Middle Eastern countries lagged so far behind the democratization process that has moved forward in almost every other region of the world? Now, it's moved forward in those regions in fits and starts, and there are clearly differences in the progress of democratization between Latin America and Central Europe, between Asia and Africa. But the fact is that the idea of democracy has, in most places of the world, captured enough attention domestically to become a factor in the domestic politics of countries. And there are debates over whether or not there has to be economic openness before political openness. The late Mansour Olson, one of the great American economic specialists, contributed to this argument in arguing against the Chinese model. The Chinese are, in a sense, trying to develop their economy in an open manner while containing the political effects of openness and regulating the effects. And Mansour Olson said at some point that will come crashing down because you need the political openness in order to support economic openness. It's an interesting debate, but it suggests to you that it's a debate that each country that's moving through this process can go through. And yet in the Middle East, there doesn't even seem to be the debate. And if it's not stimulated from the outside, it almost doesn't take place. Now, we had democracy programs as a United States government even before this administration came into office. Through our Agency for International Development, we have supported programs to build up institutional capacity, to build up non-governmental organizations, NGOs, to build up the ability of individuals to play in the political arena. And what we've tried to do is to stimulate enough interest on the part of individuals within the society, within the confines of a particular political culture, to have this become an organic process of development. Because we have understood, at least until these past couple of years, that you can export the idea of democracy, but you can't export democracy itself. The question then is, why does the Middle East seem so resistant to the idea of openness and democratic political development? Now, one can ask that question with even more vigor when looking back over the past couple of years at a very interesting process that took place under the auspices of the United Nations Development Program. A few years ago, UNDP decided that it didn't want to ask Westerners what to do about the growth of openness and democracy in the Middle East. It would ask people from the region itself. And it gathered, I think it was about 70 or so Arab intellectuals, and said to them, you define what are the problems within your own societies that need to get fixed. And the Arab intellectuals produced the first of what has now become a regular set of reports called the Arab Development Report that defined three critical deficits in Arab society. Number one was a deficit of freedom. Arab intellectuals said about their own societies that they don't enjoy enough freedom of speech, association, press, the freedoms that we cherish so much in the West. The Arabs identified as being lacking, as being a deficit in their own society. Second deficit they identified was a deficit of knowledge. They said, yes, we have schools and we have universities, but we are training our students through rote memorization. And we're not challenging our students to not only learn what we teach them, but to think for themselves. And so they called for major changes in the education system. And the Arab intellectuals identified a deficit in women's empowerment. And they said, this is simply a matter of the utilization of human resources. Half of our societies, they said, have too many barriers to their participation in public life or economic life. And so we're holding ourselves back. And if we would open up more pathways for women to be involved in the workplace, in the educational system, to be involved in society, we would therefore enjoy the benefits of the production of what the women produce. So the question is not that the Arab societies don't know what's wrong with themselves. We now know that they do know what has to be changed. The question is, why have they not started down that pathway, which would over time become a pathway towards openness and democratization? Fourth issue is terrorism. Now, we know that not every Muslim and not every Muslim fundamentalist is a terrorist, but too many terrorists have proved to be Muslims, and too many terrorists have proved to be Muslim fundamentalists. Now, this is a problem for us and for Europeans and for other targets of terrorism, because we have to figure out a way to defend ourselves and defend our way of life. But I would submit that it's a greater problem for Islam, for Muslim society. Why is Islam producing people who turn to violence in such numbers and to such a degree? I mentioned earlier today that a very interesting study was done in Egypt in the 1990s. You may recall that Egypt went through a very difficult period in which they were subjected to very harsh terrorism on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic groupings. And the Egyptians responded in a very tough manner. A lot of people were killed, a lot of people were jailed, and eventually the regime regained the upper hand, and the threat from Islamic terrorism, in this case, receded. The Egyptians then allowed Egyptian sociologists to enter the jails to try to determine what was it that was impelling so many of their young people to take up violence and terrorism. They expected to find that these were poor people with no hope, and they were bought off, that the preachers were providing money and support, and these were people who essentially were selling themselves for terrorism. They found something quite different. They found that the terrorists who had been captured, not killed, were middle class or lower middle class, educated people who had gone to the university in the hope of upward mobilization, using university education to try to move from wherever their station in life had been into a higher station in life, had found that pathway blocked because there are not enough jobs being created by the Egyptian economy for university graduates, and therefore became susceptible to the appeal that the preachers were using, which said Islam is the answer, which is the first appeal that is made to potential adherents. Now, the question for Islam is not to be the answer. Islam can be the answer to a lot of questions for adherents to that faith. The question for Muslims, though, is what turns people from an adherence to a faith which is one of the world's great religions to this bent toward violence and terrorism. A professor of mine, Charles Issaoui, he was at Columbia, he subsequently went to Princeton, the late Charles Issaoui, once said half-jokingly, and he could say so as an Arab, that the problem with Islam is that it had not undergone a Protestant Reformation. And everybody laughed, it was a cute quip. But what he was trying to identify is the fact that Islam needed at that time, and even needs today, a trend in which there is self-examination, not so much about the tenets of faith as about the proclivity toward violence that seems to be produced by so many within that religion. The fifth issue to look at in this region is the persistence of conflicts. We talk a lot about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and surely this has been on near the top of the world's agenda for quite some time. But the Middle East has a lot of conflicts. During the 1990s, for example, more people were killed inside Algeria in Algeria's internal trouble than were killed in the Arab-Israeli conflict. There's conflict in Sudan. There continues to be tension in Algeria. There's conflict in the Gulf. There was conflict that had nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict between Iraq and its neighbor Kuwait that prompted Iraq to swallow or attempt to swallow Kuwait in 1990. Why is this region producing so many conflicts? Sure, colonialization, the effects of the imposition of Western rule for so many years certainly played a factor. But Western rule existed elsewhere. Colonialism existed elsewhere. And it seems, at least, that the Middle East is more prone to internal violence than some other regions of the world. And there seems to be a proclivity toward violence that we don't see elsewhere in the world. Right now, and we can talk about this more in the discussion period, you have one of the greatest threats to both regional stability and world stability coming from Iran, a country that not only is a major state supporter of terrorism, a country that not only has declared itself in favor of the destruction of another member state of the United Nations. The president of Iran stands up openly and calls for Israel's destruction. But now it's a state that's trying to proliferate and obtain nuclear weapons. And that combination is volatile anywhere. It's particularly volatile in this very volatile region. So you've got these problems: globalization, the misuse of energy resources, failure to democratize, persistence of conflicts, terrorism. And you have a region that seems to be in very, very challenging straits. Now, what has the United States done about this? We have had, over the past 50 years, a remarkably stable set of national interests. In other words, presidents, Democrat and Republican, have defined as our interests in the Middle East almost the same set of issues over the course of the last 50 years. In fact, if I had been here 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I'd probably be describing in almost the same terms what the administration then in office would have told you were our interests in the Middle East. And we've essentially defined our interest in the area of 5 key issues of importance to us. Number one, it's to have good relations, beneficial relations, with moderate Arab countries. In other words, the United States would like to be friends with and have mutually beneficial relations with Arab states in the region. Secondly, we would like to prevent or help states themselves prevent threats to their internal stability or threats deriving from external aggression. This was particularly salient during the period of the Soviet Union when there was a Soviet-American rivalry that played itself out, but it's equally salient today when the threats may derive more from internal factors than from external factors. We have had an interest in preserving Israel's existence and its security and well-being, and this has persisted throughout 58 years of Israeli statehood. We have had an interest in the peace process, in trying to stimulate a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it has engaged secretaries of state and presidents at least since 1970, when Secretary of State William Rogers came out with the first kind of clearly American initiative, and it's played itself out throughout the course of the years. You heard in the introduction that Ken Yalowitz gave me, the various Schultz initiatives and Baker initiatives, and now you have a Bush vision of the Middle East. You had the Carter plan that ended up at Camp David. You had the Clinton parameters. The United States has been defined for the last at least 35 years, and in fact, since the early 1950s, with the pursuit of peace in the Middle East. And our 5th interest has been to assure that Middle East energy resources would be available for the world to purchase them, both because we need them, but also because our allies need them. And no matter when you would ask the question of what interests we were pursuing in the Middle East, that answer would come out. These are our 5 interests. Now, if you analyze our successes and failures, I would argue that we have not had a stellar record of success, but we've had more successes than you would expect when you have interests that are inherently contradictory. One can argue that if the Arabs and Israelis are fighting with each other, and an outside party like the United States says, well, we want to be friends with both, that's 2 of our interests, friends with Israel, friends with the Arabs, and we want to be a third party to try to resolve the conflict, you'd say this is nuts, you can't do that. And yet this is what we've tried to do, not without success. 1979 peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, which has lasted remarkably well for 27 years. There has not ever been a violation of the security annex of that treaty, which is at the heart of the Egyptian-Israeli treaty. 1994, peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. There has not been a violation of any aspect of that treaty in the last 12 years. The efforts that we made that resulted in the breakthrough at Madrid, in which virtually every Arab country sat down to negotiate with Israel, and led to not only bilateral negotiations between Israel and Arab parties, but we had for a few years a multilateral process. I was able to chair during that period our multilateral steering group, which brought together, and it's going to be hard to believe today, Israel, Palestinians, Jordanians, Egyptians, Saudis, Tunisians, some Europeans, and Japan and Russia. We've had successes over the course of these years in the pursuit of each of our interests. And yet, going back to the earlier part of my presentation, we have a region which is in crisis. Weak regimes, almost all of them suffering from succession crises. Not much movement towards democracy. Not much movement towards economic change that can deal with the region's endemic economic problems. Not enough jobs are being created. Demography is outstripping the capability of this region to produce jobs and food and the requirements for stability. Terrorists, insurgents, conflict, violence. It's a region that's in very serious crisis and remains so. Question then is what to do about it. And let me conclude the formal part of my presentation with 6 ideas, which are easy to say now that I'm out of government, and I can blame all those damn bureaucrats in Washington for not paying attention. But I think if we give some thought to retooling some of our foreign policy mechanisms and priorities, we might help Middle Easterners who want to help themselves. First of all is the retooling of our foreign assistance. Remarkably, in 1998, the then Prime Minister of the State of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, in a joint address to Congress, said to the Congress, Israel does not need American economic assistance any longer. And he was right. The 90s witnessed a boom in the Israeli economy in which Israel began outstripping in its GNP and GDP per capita almost all of Europe. The Intifada years, the 5 years of Palestinian violence, set that back a bit. But the Israeli economy today is on a very sound footing, as exemplified this past weekend when Warren Buffett made the first foreign investment that he has ever made by buying an Israeli company for $4 billion in cash. And the statement he made to his investors was, this is going to prove to be one of my good investments, you know, follow me. And of course, the investors love what he does. Berkshire Hathaway does really, really well. But it tells you that if he has confidence in the Israeli economy, why are we still providing economic assistance to the State of Israel? Now let me be clear, Israel needs security assistance. It cannot produce the kind of resources that it requires to pay for the weapon systems that it needs to defend itself. And for that, the United States must remain an ally and secure source of assistance to Israel for its security assistance. But when the Israeli government tells us they don't need the economic assistance, why are we still providing it? Now, one could make the argument that if our foreign assistance pot were expandable, you can give more to Israel and you can give more to the rest of the world. But the fact is that Congress, in its wisdom, usually puts a lid on our foreign assistance pot, which means that what you give to one country is not given to other countries. And so by retooling our economic assistance in a manner that protects our ally Israel through security aid, but frees up resources, we may be able to stimulate some more activity in the Arab world towards infrastructure, towards job creation, towards women's empowerment in areas where that can be useful. Second is to retool our democratization policy. I do not subscribe to this administration's views about exporting democracy through the United States military. And I think we made a mistake in defining that as our objective in Iraq. We have to find a way to redefine our objective. But it doesn't mean that we should stop supporting efforts to build democracy. And as I suggested earlier, the Arab Development Report has given us the answer that we need. We say to the Arabs, you have defined the problem for yourself. We will support you. Develop programs. Develop programs for knowledge. Develop programs for women's empowerment. Develop programs for expanding freedoms within your society. These are your programs to meet your priorities, and we can support them. And over time, that may be an approach that actually helps build a democratic culture and moves these societies forward on the pathway to democracy. Third, this is going to sound worse than I mean it, kill terrorists. Why have we diverted resources from the place where terrorists continue to operate, which is in Afghanistan, to other objectives, and therefore not been able to sustain our counter-terrorist operations as well as we might have in Afghanistan? I have no sympathy for terrorists, and I am not embarrassed by arguing that we should kill them before they kill us. But I do argue with ourselves when we try to expand our reach into a lot of other areas and we find that we're handicapping our own capability to deal with one of the number one threats to our country, and that is to kill the terrorists in the places where they are before they can get to us. Fourth, as a priority for us, is to stop the Iranian nuclear program. Now, this is an area which is a no-brainer, and it doesn't actually represent much of a critique of our policy in Washington, because this is a high priority of the administration. The administration a few years ago found a way to declassify enough intelligence information so as to bring the Iranian file to the International Atomic Energy Agency and to prove that the Iranians had cheated on their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it was open to the world to see, and we succeeded since then through diplomacy to force the Iranians to sign on to an additional protocol of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And then recently, because of continued Iranian non-compliance, that file has been moved to the UN Security Council where the world is considering sanctions. This is a critical priority for our country. And for those who doubt the efficacy of diplomacy, I like to cite an article that was written a couple of years ago by the deputy director of the Israeli Atomic Energy Agency, who actually wrote that diplomacy has succeeded more often than not in stopping the proliferation of nuclear weapons. When America is determined to use diplomatic tools, and diplomatic tools can include sanctions, when it's determined to use diplomatic tools, we have succeeded more often than not in stopping or at least slowing down the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The class of 1950 probably remembers John F. Kennedy's comment in 1962 in which he said there were going to be 25 nuclear powers by the end of the century. And there weren't. And that was a result of concerted American efforts to prevent proliferation. We must stop the Iranian nuclear program. Number 5, I think we need to do better in seizing opportunities for Arab-Israeli peace. And that's not just rhetoric. I could spend a lot of time with you in self-criticism of what we failed to do, let alone what the parties failed to do, since the Oslo Accords came into being, to exploit opportunities that presented themselves. Even during the Intifada, there were moments when there were chances to turn the Intifada from a military confrontation into something other than that. And the parties themselves didn't do it, and we didn't do it. We didn't do our job well enough in monitoring compliance, in preventing unilateralism by the two sides, whether it's in the area of terrorism or the area of settlements. And I don't equate the two on moral terms. But unilateral activities by both sides tend to undermine confidence of the other side in the ability of the two sides to reach an agreement. We need to do better if, in fact, we continue to say that the Arab-Israeli peace process is a major interest of our country. And finally, I would argue that we need a serious national energy policy. If the Middle East is not going to figure out what to do with its own energy resources and fix itself, we need to do something about our energy policy. And it's not enough to tinker. What we didn't do 10 years ago in creating alternative energy resources and finding ways to diversify our energy supplies, we are suffering for today. And if we don't make changes today, I'll be back here in 10 years telling you that we're still suffering. Now, I don't believe that we should establish as a national objective energy independence. It's a foolish objective to put out there. But we can certainly diversify in a manner that puts us on a better footing with the suppliers of oil and gas and gives us options to play the market when prices get out of whack. So these are 6 ideas that some of them are a little bit different, some of them are quite different from the way in which we've pursued our policies until now. I think the interests that we've defined as a country remain valid. The pursuit of these interests will remain on our agenda for some time. And I think it's imperative that we develop these ideas in order to come to grips with the Middle Eastern states themselves with the problems that are so serious and which are impeding the development of that region. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think we're ready to take questions now, and as usual, I always ask to give students priority in asking questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. Is it way in the back? You lead off.
How do you feel with the election of Hamas in the Palestinian Authority and the subsequent...
Hold on. Stand up. Maybe identify yourself so we know who you are. Project.
I'm a sophomore at Dartmouth. My name is Robert King. How do you feel that the election of Hamas as the Palestinian Authority and the subsequent aid being revoked from Europe and the U.S. is going to play out in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Did everybody get the question? What I feel about the election of Hamas and then the subsequent cutoff of aid from the international community. I would suggest that the election of Hamas represents a rather significant shift within the balance of power in Palestinian society. And it was one that was rather long in coming. After the Oslo Accords created a Palestinian Authority, the Fatah movement, the secular national party, essentially the party of Yasser Arafat, came into power and was expected by Palestinians to produce a relatively open, accountable governance for Palestine, to prepare the Palestinians for independence. In fact, if you go back to the Oslo Accords, the first implementation agreement of Oslo was signed on May 4th, 1994, and it said that 5 years from that date, an independent Palestinian state should be created because it will be ready by then. Well, not only was it not ready after 5 years, but after 12 years, the Palestinian population essentially kicked Fatah out of office because of rampant corruption and mismanagement and a failure to lead. It's been said that the Palestinian Authority on the eve of this election was the only failed pre-state in existence in the world. So Hamas came in against the backdrop of very serious problems that had been created because of mismanagement of the Palestinian economy and society. It came into power as a result of a failed peace process. Fatah also failed to deliver a promised peace, and that largely was a result of a minuet between Israel and the Palestinians, in which both sides would share approximately equal blame for the failure of the peace process that was launched at Oslo. And so you had this major protest, and of course you also had some within the Palestinian community who liked Hamas's ideology, who did see, in this case, Islam as the answer. Now, for the rest of the world, the election of Hamas was not expected, even though some of these trends should have been evident for some time. There was a sense of shock that set in January when the election results were tabulated. And the United States and Europe have basically decided that since we have previously declared Hamas to be a terrorist organization, we cannot abide recognizing or dealing with that organization even if it was elected in a democratic election. And the Palestinian election was democratic. It was free and fair, monitored internationally, and seen to be without fault. But even though the result was achieved freely and fairly, the United States and Europe have said we cannot deal with the party in power unless it meets three conditions. Number one, it has to accept the right of its neighbor Israel to exist. Number two, it has to renounce terrorism, which is the reason why the United States and Europe had declared Hamas to be a terrorist organization. And three, it has to accept, to abide by the agreements previously entered into by the Palestinian Authority. Hamas, for its reasons, has decided until now that it doesn't want to do those things. I can understand why they don't want to do it, even though I would hope that they find a way to move somewhat towards these goals. And so we have a standoff now in which the United States and Europe are using the economic leverage of aid to try to bring about change of policy on the part of Hamas, and we're in the midst of a very challenging period. The prospect for Palestinians is not good. There is already rampant unemployment. It's likely to get worse. There will likely be shortages of food in certain areas, although not necessarily society-wide. And societal pressures will build up a great deal because of the absence of financing of needed goods. So we're in for a very hot summer, I think.
My name's Mike Stroop. My question concerns like U.S. military presence in the Middle East, and just something you didn't cover. And you know, there's been talk previously that a lot of terrorism is increased possibly by the troops that were previously in Saudi Arabia, so on and so forth. What would be, like, in your prescription going forward, what would be, you know, the perfect level of U.S. presence in the Middle East in terms of troops on the ground? Would it involve completely pulling out, which is something that Professor Eugene Gulls spoke about last week, just letting things go the way they will, or does it involve having a large naval presence offshore, or does it involve having troops in Iraq for the next 50 years?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm glad you've had some experts here to talk about it. Let me suggest a couple of ways to look at the question. Not being an expert, I don't want to pretend to give you definitive answers. Number one, we have had an interest to have our troops in the Middle East but Middle Eastern countries have also had an interest in having our troops represent an umbrella of security for them. We have been unsuccessful in developing a region-wide security understanding. We tried, for example, after the 1991 Gulf War, to create a GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council +2, being Syria and Egypt model, in which a security outlook would be agreed among these 8 states, and it would regulate in some way the American military presence, and that also failed. So, number one, the imperative that keeps the American forces in the region is driven both by our own needs, but also by the needs of the region itself, number one. Number two, in cases where we have pulled out our troops, for example, from Saudi Arabia in the last couple of years, it hasn't necessarily changed the degree to which others have seen our overall presence as a lightning rod around which to mobilize opposition. In the early 90s, the forerunner of al-Qaeda decided that the enemy was the United States and its presence in the Middle East, contaminating the holy places of Islam. And it almost didn't matter if we were physically stationed in Saudi Arabia or we were stationed offshore providing a security blanket. That said, I think it would be folly for us to assume that we can maintain certainly the current level of troop strength in that region. We have, what, 115, 120,000, maybe 130,000 troops in Iraq itself now, plus all of the support mechanisms that are required to keep the rotations of troops through there. There would be folly to think that we can do that, but we do need to define a different security posture which will meet our needs, and we will continue to have security requirements, maintaining our interest in preserving stability and preventing external and internal aggression, but also trying to define better what the sensitivities are of the states in whose country our troops are stationed. So it gives you a little bit of a model to look at, although it doesn't specifically get to your question, because it's the issue right now is skewed as a result of our engagement in Iraq. It's going to be very hard to project a major reorientation until we figure out how to get out of the Iraq morass. And at that point, we will need a new defense strategy, which hopefully would regulate our troop presence better.
Other student hands? Okay, well, if a student wants to raise a question, please do so. Sir, please jump in.
You raised a very interesting deficit in your talk, and that is the knowledge deficit. Seems to me that we've been reasonably successful in the Middle East when we have put university presences down and have developed that aspect of our relationships. I wondered if you would talk to how we could do better there. I'm reminded that the New York Times said early in the Bush administration that the cutting of the information broadcast from Europe turned out to cut the main way in which the Iranian students could tell the world about the successes they were having, and whether or not there aren't information-based things that could do a lot for us.
Yeah. Let me suggest 3 alternative models, one of which has proved successful, as you suggested, one of which has just started, so we don't know how to evaluate it yet, and a third which we haven't really tried. The one that's proved relatively successful is the establishment of so-called American universities. We have one in Cairo, there's one in Beirut, there's now one in Kuwait. They're not actually American universities. They're universities that their forerunners were missionary movements that grew into colleges and universities, but they have decidedly an American character to them. The curriculum is largely modeled after American universities. And they have proved in both Beirut and Cairo to be much more successful in many ways than the local universities. The graduates end up entering into the elite jobs in society. Many of them can move easily into business and graduate schools abroad and then come back with the graduate degrees from outside, and it's actually proved to be quite successful. So it's a model that has worked. There's no reason why it can't work in other places as well. Second model, which has just started, is the effort by some Arab countries to buy the equivalent of an American university. In Qatar, for example, they've created what they've called University City, and they invited American universities to bid on the ability to set up 4-year degree programs in Qatar for Qatari students. Georgetown has been, I think, first out of the starting block, and they have a 4-year program where Georgetown faculty rotates in and out together with local faculty. It's too early to know if this will succeed, but one can imagine that it may succeed. It may produce the equivalent of a kind of homegrown American university through an imported or exported model. The third, at a different level, was something that we tried in Egypt. As part of our aid program in Egypt, we had provided over the previous 25 years about $750 million of assistance to the Egyptian educational system. And after I became ambassador, I asked for the metrics. Had this aid actually done anything for Egyptian education? And the results were astounding. There was no improvement in almost any category over the 25 years of our aid program in education. We had astoundingly good results in infrastructure. We built the Egyptian electricity system, their water wastewater system, their mobile telephone system. We had phenomenal results. But in soft power issues like education, virtually no success at all. And so I went to the Minister of Education and I said to him, you're not going to get another dime until you come up with a reform program. So we had a crisis for about 6 months because, you know, I was the big nasty American coming in and forcing him to do what I wanted him to do. And I didn't want him to do anything that he didn't want to do himself. I said, I'm not going to give you a reform program, but until you produce one, you know, I'm going to give my money elsewhere. And we finally got a reform program out of the Egyptians. It's not one that I would have done up. Not ambitious enough, not broad enough, but it didn't matter. At least over the next few years, hopefully we can see some change. I haven't actually checked in the past year or two but to see if any of the metrics were starting to be met, but at least we have the effort to reform. So this is something we can do elsewhere if we have leverage, as we had in Egypt, where we had money to dispense or to withhold. But I think you're exactly right. It's one of those areas where you can actually have an impact, and you do have models that have worked that can be exploited in the future.
My question is again about exporting democracy, and you mentioned that you don't support President Bush's sort of way of exporting it with military force, but you also said that you do generally support democracy. Democracy is the kind of thing like mother of an apple pie. But what do you make of a criticism that now comes more from the right of Bush, from people like Dale Pipes and many others, that if exporting democracy means giving Hamas as Palestinian authority, it is not worth it, it is a mistake, they're not ready for it, because if we do export it and then they elect someone that we really don't like, and I think for good reasons, it looks sort of hypocritical. What is your response to this kind of, you know, if exporting democracy gives us Islamic fundamentalist governments, whether it's Egypt or Palestine, then it's a bad idea.
Yeah, I would normally be hesitant to say I agree with Daniel Pipes, but if that's what he said, I agree with him. And it's an additional argument to bolster the case that you can't export what is required by way of political culture. You have to have something like a democratic culture in a country before you can have an election that has meaning. And it's not an American political culture. I don't want to think that our system, however much we like it, is going to work someplace else. It developed as a result of our political history and our particular foibles and our crises and our internal battles. So I don't pretend that we can do that in Iraq or in El Salvador or anywhere else. But those countries have to develop their own, for want of a better word, political culture, which can sustain the protection of rights and the extension of freedoms and the limitations on the power of government and the power that derives from the people to let government run. And as they develop that, then elections produce results. In that case, if elections produce a result that we don't like, we live with it and we deal with it. But it's easy for me now to say I don't accept to deal with Hamas because the election that produced Hamas was a mechanism. It was not a democratic expression within a democratic environment. If the Palestinian Authority over 12 years had governed openly and transparently, and there had been all those protections and freedoms we talked about, and then they chose Hamas, I'd feel real bad. I probably wouldn't be up here talking to you because I would have been fired. I wouldn't have retired. But the reality was they would have made an informed choice within the context of a democratic political culture. That's not what happened.
I'm curious about, you talked about how the American interests in the Middle East have more or less remained static over the last 30 years or so. And I'm curious, how well those interests are serving us. In the initial part of your discussion, you talked about the problems that are facing the region, and one of those problems, for instance, was democracy. And in your prescription for the region, you talked about rethinking that democracy policy. However, democracy itself was not one of the issues that you talked about as one of our committed policies towards the region. And it also seems that some of those policies that we have kind of undercut other ones. For example, having a relationship with moderate Arab states and at the same time having stabilization, because sometimes those moderate Arab states do things that violate human rights. The human rights record in the Arab Middle East is not very good. And certainly it doesn't promote democracy. So if we want a stable country, Iraq used to be stable when Saddam Hussein was governing it, but we claim that we don't like that. And so it seems that some of these policies that we have towards the Middle East aren't really getting us the distance of where we claim that we want to be going. And I was wondering, number one, how sincere do you think we really are? I think it's foreseeable that we would have problems, in that region with the stated objectives that we claim to be having.
It's a great question. You're exactly right. And I would only add to the question by saying that when we have pursued all of our interests in moderate form, we have been relatively successful. It's when we have failed to pursue some of the interests and gone overboard in the pursuit of other interests where we have run into problems. We found a way over these years to essentially balance off mutually contradictory interests. And we never were able to develop such good relations with Arab states because of the limitations of our relationship with Israel. But we had good relations with Arab states. If we went overboard in one direction or the other, we would lose our ability to play in both arenas. So it becomes a kind of constant regulatory mechanism where you are balancing off the pursuit of peace versus the pursuit of bilateral relations versus the need for energy versus the need for stability. And a policy in moderation has, I would suggest, proved to be the best antidote to some of the contradictions that you talk about. But
care about democracy in the region? Do we really, if we had a bunch of, because essentially the Arab world is all dictators. As long as they keep their people in check and there's no violence over there, I believe that would probably be okay for our administration.
Yeah, the answer I would say is yes, only because as a people we've cared about it. And, for the last 70, 80, 90 years, it has been a part of every president's agenda. It has not been an invention of George Bush or of Bill Clinton. Every president has tried to figure out a way to promote, support, encourage democracy. Some presidents have done a little bit more, some have done a little bit less, some have put their money behind the effort, some have not. We now have a president who's put the U.S. military behind the effort, which is something that had not really been tried in this way before. So the idea of democracy is as a component of our own, the culture of our foreign policy, I think, has a long-standing history to it, and you can't ignore it, which is why I tried to address it in the conclusions. It's an interest of a different sort than the kind of hard-headed realist interests that we've pursued otherwise. But I don't think you can ignore it at the peril of a sentiment that I think is quite widespread in our country.
You list the oil. I'm sorry. Okay.
Disagree with this gentleman, and there are some bright spots in the Arab world which you have not mentioned. the way I would phrase it is that the oil is a blessing, but it's also a curse. It seems that the most stable Arab countries, most livable Arab countries, are the ones which are oil poor. Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan. And Jordan is mostly Palestinian. So there seems to be an issue, and none of them are democratic in the sense that we would like to think, but they're relatively free, and their human rights abuses are, I think, quite low.
Yeah, I would agree. In relative terms, they're better off. In fact, I was asked today by some students where different countries are, what are the prospects for democratization in the Middle East? And I cited Morocco and Jordan as two countries where monarchy, with different strengths in the monarchy, is actually or potentially giving way to a kind of constitutional limitation on the powers of the monarchy. And over time, maybe over 10 or 15 years, you may actually see political change accompanying some of the economic activities in society. So I would agree, and in fact, I'll steal from you, integrate that, and leave the next audience a little happier with my outcomes.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to go back to a previous question on security and ask if it doesn't make sense for the United States to make a public declaration of its long-term interest in Iraq. And I'm thinking particularly of military bases and oil. I don't know whether that conflicts with something you've already said. But another thing that might help in terms of U.S. credibility, it seems to me, would be to close Guantanamo. I know that poses some problems for people, but I think that would help in terms of credibility in the Middle East and also in Europe.
Yeah, you certainly have clarity of purpose if you defined your objective as military bases in Iraq and the pursuit of oil. I'm not sure it would gain you. I'm not sure it would gain you many adherents, and it might, in fact, undercut whatever benefits you would gain from shutting down Guantanamo. The issues I mean, you're talking apples and oranges, and you'd have one situation in Guantanamo where, by providing greater legal protection to those we're accusing of terrorism, we would probably reduce our vulnerabilities globally. We're under some pressure for not applying our same legal standards in Guantanamo that we apply in our own country. And I would agree with you fully that that's a contradiction that we should solve. I would not agree, however, that it would do us much good to openly declare our intention to remain in Iraq in military bases. The word bases in the Middle East is one of the nastiest things you can say. Now, you can talk about access, and you can talk about facilities, and you can talk about agreements on, overflights and whatever. But given the history of colonialism and the antipathy to Western penetration, openly declaring, first of all, I don't think we want bases in Iraq, but openly declaring that as an objective, I think would really hurt us badly in that region.
I wanted to add that my point was to renounce those long-term objectives.
I'm with you. Okay. I'm sorry I misunderstood you. I thought you wanted to say we want. I'm with you.
I have a master's in government. I have an odd question. I've been looking at the question of why development has not occurred in Africa. And one very powerful argument concerns a sector of society that no one seems to mention in the Middle East, namely agriculture. And the problem in Africa, it has to do partly with climate and partly with soils. There has not been the research and development in new plant and animal technologies. The Green Revolution has made our country very rich. I've just been in Indiana. Boy, is that rich. Because those plants, for instance, are suited to our environment. Have you ever heard anybody discuss the importance of research and development in better agricultural technologies and plants and doing something to help people feed themselves? That usually reduces population excess and stuff like that. Has anybody ever discussed that?
Yeah, I can't say everybody because I don't know the specifics in all countries, but I know it was done in Egypt. They had a very longstanding Minister of Agriculture, was Deputy Prime Minister for many years, Yusuf Wali, was actually quite advanced in his thinking about the transformation of Egyptian agriculture. And if you look over his tenure, which lasted from about 1981 to about 2000, slowly but surely, Egyptian agriculture underwent a transformation. It became much more cash crop oriented, a lot of exports, and they found their niches in the European market. And Egypt is not self-sufficient in terms of food production, but is doing better. The problem that Yusuf Wali identified is in his Deputy Prime Minister hat. As Minister of Agriculture, he wanted to take this to the limit. As Deputy Prime Minister, though, he didn't have anything to do with the people who would have been freed up from the agricultural sector and moved to the big city looking for jobs. Because the economy, the larger economy, was not producing enough jobs to absorb the excess agricultural labor. So you ended up with a radical transformation in the countryside, and yet an effort by the government to keep people in the countryside because they didn't want to come in the cities. They came in anyway, and there was a huge unemployment problem as a result of it. But a lot of them stayed, mainly because there was nothing to do with them. And that then means, it suggests at least, that you're right that you need that revolution in research and development and technology, but it has to go hand in hand with the effort by society essentially to create jobs. And that goes back to the globalization argument. If you don't have a globalization argument, find something else that's going to produce jobs. In the case of oil wealth, it may be just using oil wealth to build stuff, to build factories. But it also means that the society needs a job production effort to absorb that labor, and otherwise you're going to have a lot of very unhappy agricultural people thrown out of work in a sector that's improving and having no place to go.
Yeah.
So, turning to the question of democratization and what that means for peace in the Middle East, I'd like to ask you about the question of Lebanon. Lebanon's an interesting story. It has many years of fairly successful confederal government with power sharing between Christians and Muslims. It has the recent people power revolution that's at least reduced Syria's role. But on the other hand, if Israel's the tinderbox of the Middle East, or whatever Hezbollah calls it, Lebanon's been fairly incendiary too, with harboring Hezbollah, harboring terrorists. Do you think the democratization in Lebanon is going to result in near-term better relationship with Israel?
It's a very good question, and a better study needs to be made of what happened to Lebanon. You know the cartoon character who runs off the edge of a cliff, and as long as his legs keep churning, he keeps going, and as soon as he looks down, Lebanon was that way before 1975. It was a confessional system in which power sharing was based on the absence of a census. The agreement had been reached on the allocation of power among the three major communities. Their population shifted over time, but nobody wanted to know that. And as long as nobody asked the question, nobody looked down, the system kept going. In the mid-70s, as a result of Jordans having kicked the PLO out of Jordan after the 1970 uprising, a new element came into the society, and that was essentially Palestinian Sunni Muslims. And so you had a Palestinian problem in Lebanon, and you had an alteration of the confessional balance. And all of a sudden, the Sunnis said, well, if we count the Palestinians, we're stronger. And then the Shia said, we know that we're the majority. If you don't ask us the question, we'll live with the powers allocated to us. But if you're going to start counting Palestinians, we're actually the majority. And the Maronites said, we're going to run to Israel as allies because we know that we're the minority. And the whole system collapsed as a result of this external factor. Now the question you raise is, okay, all this ended. Palestinians essentially, PLO was essentially kicked out. You still have a large Palestinian refugee community in Lebanon, but it is essentially under control. They haven't been given citizenship. They don't count in any of these confessional numbers. Can Lebanon become an example of Middle East democratization? Maybe. We, back on the question of whether an election is real if it elects a terrorist group, Lebanon also elected Hezbollah to significant portions of the Lebanese parliament. And you've not seen the same reaction from us in Lebanon as you have in Palestine, because the Lebanese system is more advanced in that regard. They're not there yet, but I think we're watching it differently to see whether or not over time the Lebanese system can accommodate itself to Hezbollah, but also if Hezbollah can accommodate itself to the requirements of democratic change. So it's a work in progress, and one that's very interesting, but whose history proves the opposite point. You know, the Lebanese system was an artificial democratic system before '75, and you know, the pin came, punctured the balloon, or you know, the character looked down, and it collapsed at that point.
Time for one or two more questions. You had your hand up a long time.
Going back to one of the very early questions about the West cutting off aid and money to Palestine, and then now we hear Iran is deciding to give money. Is that potentially going to lead other Arab countries into doing that same thing?
No. I think there will be. The question was with the cutoff of assistance by the U.S. and Europe to Palestine, to Hamas. We now hear that Iran has offered to fill that gap. Is that going to lead other Arab countries to do the same? And the answer is it might. There is great ambivalence in the Arab world about Hamas's victory. On the one hand, most Arab states want Hamas to fail, largely because they don't want to see Hamas in their own midst, their local Hamas win. On the other hand, they don't want to see a humanitarian catastrophe in Palestine. And so Arab states, not so much following the Iranian model, but for their own interests, have been pressing very hard to find a way to address the humanitarian requirements of the Palestinian people, even if it doesn't mean supporting Hamas. And I'm not sure we're going to be clever enough to make that, to draw that distinction too finely. So the answer is it might lead the Arab states, in fact, to deliver assistance to the quote-unquote Palestinian people, but effectively that's going to help Hamas because it'll relieve some of the pressure on them.
Seems to me that to lower tensions in the Middle East, we need to get Russia productively involved. They're sending up Israeli spy satellites. They're stopping our efforts to bring sanctions to Iran. They're trying to build a nuclear power plant for Iran, and they've been selling weapons to everybody in the Middle East. How can we get them involved in a productive manner in the Iran and the Iran-Israeli conflict?
Well, we actually tried, and not unsuccessfully, by integrating Russia into the Middle East Quartet, starting about 4 years ago. This was a grouping of the United States, the EU, Russia, and the United Nations. It effectively covered the world, and it was an effort to present a united front in dealing with the Israelis and Palestinians so that they couldn't play us off against each other. That united front has not broken apart, but it is fraying at the edges now because the Russians are seeing some advantage to their own interests of going their own way. You have to remember about the Russians that they have a lot of unanswered interests in the region that they've had to defer for many years, a lot of debt that has not been paid. They allied themselves with a lot of nasty countries, pariahs, and those are countries that we have not allowed to repay debt to Russia. They want to sell their arms like we sell arms, but our arms are better, and they often get shut out of arms markets. So I'm not feeling sorry for the Russians, but if you want to analyze their motivations, they are trying to define their interests in a way that's going to maximize their benefits. So they do market commercially their satellite launches, and the Israelis took advantage of it. They are looking to export nuclear energy that's governed by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The Russians say that they want to be careful that the Bushehr reactor would be under IAEA safeguards. The problem since the fall of the Soviet Union during the 90s was the absence of strong export controls in Russia and the inability of Russia to provide employment for all of its scientists, and they went out looking for work. And so you had a kind of breakdown of a normal system. So again, I'm not excusing Russian behavior, but you need to understand it first to try to address some of their interests. And I think if we can, we will find more common cause on Iran than less common cause. If the Russians know that we're not going to try to squeeze them out of the peaceful nuclear market, they might take a tougher stance with respect to Iran's efforts to do a clandestine nuclear program. Russians were very nervous when the issue was taken to the International Atomic Energy Agency that a deal was going to be cut whereby Europe would end up selling peaceful nuclear reactors to Iran. The Russians thought this was going to happen, and it was the end of the world for them. So, if we find a way to ensure that their interests are taken into account, maybe you get more cooperation on the security issues where it matters the most.
I think also.
You got one of the great Russian experts here, though, so I've been kind of eyeing him out of the side.
No, the other thing I was going to add is I think the Russian viewpoint has evolved somewhat in that I think they now recognize that the Iranians are probably up to no good and that is a risk to them as well. They're not prepared to do anything, I think, in the way of sanctions for all the reasons that Ambassador Kurtzer made. But I do think we have a little bit more of a common understanding of a threat. So I agree with you that I think we do have the basis to work with them, but it's going to be very difficult. Maybe one last question. Is there another student? Phil, before you go on, you had your chance. Anybody else who's not asked a question? All right, then you get the last question.
Okay, thank you.
History proves that the last question is the one you didn't want to answer.
Yeah.
Watch this. Go on.
I'm curious how much of a two-way street you view this whole process to be with the dialogue and relationship we have with the Middle East. A couple months ago, there was that Danish cartoon that put the Middle East up in arms about it. And I find it very interesting that the United States and certainly the Israelis and perhaps in a broader spectrum, the Jews in general, are, sometimes demonized in Arab political cartoons. And here, there was, I thought, a very, interesting political observation about how Islam may fuel that kind of terrorist and violent fire that we talked about at the beginning of your lecture. And yet, the mere discussion of that in a public arena completely caused really an enormous backlash, to the extent that many people in this country felt that we damaged, our relationship with the Arab world. Do we not have a strong enough relationship with these countries that we can call them, we could tell them how things are perceived to us, and that they could work on them themselves? I mean, we're so walking on eggshells sometimes over in that area of the world because we don't want to offend anybody, and yet at the same time we have our own agenda. And is there a way? I mean, how good of a friendship can we have with that part of the world if we can't be open and honest about our perception of their...
As in many friendships, you can do a lot of real heart-to-heart stuff privately, and unfortunately, in this kind of relationship, you can't do a lot of that heart-to-heart stuff publicly. And one manifestation of that took place in the Danish cartoon business. In my view, everybody handled that wrong. Now, did the Danish newspaper have the quote-unquote right to publish cartoons that were caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad? I guess under the rubric of freedom of press, they did. But why would they do it? Did the Muslims have the right to protest it? Yes, they did. But why would they engage in violence to do so? I was in Yemen, in fact, at the time. I was visiting Yemen at the time that the kind of the height of this storm. And there was a joke because there was a huge demonstration in Sana'a that all the signs said, "Close the Danish embassy." Well, there is no Danish embassy in Sana'a. Nobody had done their homework to know what they were looking for. So you had everybody kind of playing a role, and then everybody's, we support the right of the Danish public. Everybody got up on a high horse, and nobody could figure out a way to put all of this nonsense back in the box. So the answer is, it's a problem. I can almost guarantee you, without knowing this, that our representatives in the field, that academics who've lived in the area for a long time, probably had terrific conversations with their contacts. And it was very open, and everybody was self-critical. But as soon as they walked out those two doors, kind of the masks got put on, the cameras got turned on, and it became a very different dialogue. And that is a problem in dealing with that region.
Their demonization of the West or of Israel? I mean, is this something that we are critical in a formal way about, saying you can't?
Oh, all
have
the
that kind of
time, all the time. Yeah, no, as ambassador in Egypt, I constantly raised with Mubarak the hateful anti-Semitism in the Egyptian press. His response to me was, well, you come in and you want freedom of the press, and now you want me to do something about it. And I would say to him, Mr. President, I'm not asking you to shut the newspaper down. I'm asking you just to speak out. The newspaper ought to print as a headline, Mubarak criticizes anti-Semitism. If they then choose to continue to do anti-Semitism in the press, all right, criticize them again. But at some point, the society is going to get the message that the regime doesn't like it. So you had this confusion of the so-called freedom of the press with the fear of taking a stance on this issue. But we argued with it all the time, and it was raised at the president. I'm sorry?
Did he ever do that?
No. Never did. Never did. He once fired an editor for publishing anti-Christian and anti-Semitic stuff, and people got the message for a little while, but it didn't really stop the flood of stuff after that.
Now you can see why our jobs in our previous lives were so interesting.
We're both only 27 years old now. We look a little older.